My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 41 years old. And the first thing my Aunt Patricia did after we buried my mother was drive to the house I grew up in and change every lock while I was still at the repast, eating potato salad off a paper plate and accepting hugs from people whose names I could barely remember. I didn't find out until that evening. I had left the repast early. I couldn't breathe in that church hall anymore, couldn't smile at one more person who told me Loretta Calloway was in a better place. And I drove the 12 minutes from Second Mount Zion Baptist to the house on Ardmore Lane where I had lived every year of my life until I was 19. I still had my key. I had always had my key. My mother had pressed a copy into my palm the day I moved into my first apartment and said, "This will always be your home, baby. Don't you forget it." I put the key in the lock and it didn't turn. I tried again, wiggled it, pulled the door slightly toward me the way you have to with old doors that have settled into their frames over 40 years. Nothing. I stood on that porch for probably 2 full minutes before I understood what had happened. The porch where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway just beyond it. The porch where my mother used to sit in her green resin chair every summer evening with a glass of sweet tea and her word search book. The chair was still there. Her reading glasses were folded on the side table next to it, right where she'd left them, because nobody had thought to move them yet because we had buried her 9 hours ago. I called my Aunt Patricia. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I sat down in my mother's chair next to her glasses on the porch of the house my mother had left to me in her will, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry all week. Not just for her, for what I was already beginning to understand. My mother, Loretta Ann Calloway, died on a Tuesday in late October. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed 14 months before, managed with a ferocity and a quiet dignity that was entirely consistent with who she was as a woman. She did not complain often. She did not ask for help easily. What she did was make a plan, because Loretta Calloway had always made plans. And part of that plan was her will, which she had drawn up with a notary at the kitchen table, handwritten and witnessed, 8 months before she died. The house on Ardmore Lane was mine. She had told me this directly. We had sat together at that same kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in March, sunlight coming through the yellow curtains she'd hung in 1987 and never replaced, and she had walked me through it. The house, her savings account, modest around $18,000, her jewelry, her car. She wanted her sister Patricia to be the executor because, she said, Patricia is organized and she knows how to deal with paperwork. I didn't argue. Patricia was organized. She was also cold and competitive and had spent 30 years resenting my mother in ways I had always sensed but never been able to name. But she was family, and my mother trusted her. And I was so focused on keeping my mother alive that the question of what would happen after felt abstract, almost cruel to think about. I should have thought about it. I should have asked more questions at that kitchen table. I should have pulled out my phone and recorded every word my mother said about her wishes. I should have called a probate attorney the week she was diagnosed instead of spending that energy reading clinical trial results at 2 in the morning. But I didn't. Because I was her daughter. And daughters, when their mothers are dying, do not sit across the table and think about legal strategy. They hold hands, they watch old movies. They learn how to give injections and manage pain medication schedules and call the hospice nurse at 3 a.m. and say, "I don't know what I'm doing," in a whisper so their mother can't hear from the next room. That's what I did for the last 14 months of my mother's life. I drove 40 minutes each way from my apartment in Decatur to her house in Stone Mountain 3, sometimes 4 times a week. I managed her medications. I took her to her oncology appointments at Emory. I coordinated with the hospice team, communicated with her doctors, organized her pantry so the home health aide could find everything, and sat with her on that porch in her green chair on the evenings when she felt well enough to be outside. Patricia visited 4 times in 14 months. I know because I kept a calendar. I wasn't keeping it as evidence. I was keeping it because I was exhausted and I needed to track who was coming and when so I could plan around it. But those pages exist. 4 visits, 14 months, 4 Sunday afternoons where Patricia swept in with a casserole and a cloud of Chanel number 5, kissed my mother on the cheek, and spent most of the visit telling us about her renovated kitchen. And then my mother died. And Patricia, who had been named executor of an estate she had contributed nothing to protecting, drove to Ardmore Lane with a locksmith before the reception food had been cleared away. I sat in that green chair until it got dark. My mother's reading glasses caught the last of the October light. I didn't move them. I couldn't. My phone buzzed. A text from my cousin Denise, Patricia's youngest daughter, the only one in that family I had ever trusted. Renee, call me when you can. There's something you need to know about what my mother is planning. Patricia Elaine Mosley, née Calloway, was my mother's younger sister by 4 years, and she had spent most of those 4 years trying to close the distance between what my mother had and what she believed she deserved. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the only way to understand what happened, and understanding it is the only thing that kept me from losing my mind in the months that followed. Patricia wasn't evil in the way villains are evil in movies, cartoonish and obvious, telegraphing their intentions. She was something harder to defend against. She was a woman who had convinced herself, over decades of careful revisionist thinking, that the good things in my mother's life had somehow been taken from her. My mother had the house. Patricia had an apartment in Lithonia until she was 34 when she married Gerald Mosley, a man with a good government job and a short temper, and moved into a split level in Conyers that she spent the next 20 years upgrading piece by piece, as if renovation could manufacture the feeling she was chasing. My mother had a daughter who called every Sunday. Patricia had 3 children who called when they needed something. My mother had a garden in the backyard with tomatoes and collard greens and a fig tree she planted from a cutting her own mother gave her. Patricia had a landscaping service that came on Thursdays. None of these things were my mother's fault, but Patricia had arranged the facts of their 2 lives into a story where they were. I had always felt the coldness beneath Patricia's politeness. The way she would survey my mother's living room when she visited, her eyes moving across the furniture, the photographs, the shelves of books with an inventory quality, cataloging, assessing. The way she called my mother Loretta in a tone that somehow made the name sound like an accusation. The way she would say things like, "You've always had such a gift for making a home," in a voice that meant something other than a compliment. My mother either didn't notice or chose not to. Loretta Calloway was not a woman who carried grudges or assigned malicious intent where she could assign something more forgivable. She loved her sister the way she'd been raised to love family, completely, without terms, with a patience that I sometimes found heartbreaking to witness. Patricia means well, she told me once after a visit that had left me gripping the steering wheel in the driveway for 5 minutes before I could drive. She's just never been at peace with herself. I think about that sentence a lot now. The house on Ardmore Lane had been their parents' house. My grandparents, Claudette and Earl Calloway, who had bought it in 1971 and raised both girls inside its walls. When my grandfather died in 2003, he left the house to my grandmother outright. When my grandmother died in 2011, she left it to my mother, not to both daughters equally, not split down the middle, but to my mother alone. The will was clear. The reasoning, as my grandmother had explained it privately to my mother, and which my mother had shared with me in one of our kitchen table conversations, was practical. My mother lived nearby, had been the primary caretaker for both parents in their final years, and was, in my grandmother's honest assessment, the more responsible of the two. Patricia had never forgiven any of them for it, not her parents for deciding it, not my mother for accepting it. And I understood this only in retrospect, not me for being the person my mother was likely to pass it to next. The will my mother wrote in March was handwritten, which I know now carries specific legal vulnerabilities in the state of Georgia. It was witnessed by 2 people, her neighbor, Mrs. Frances Dupree, who was 73 and had lived next door since 1985, and a woman from her church named Odessa Grant. Both women had signed. My mother had been coherent, deliberate, and entirely herself that afternoon. I know because I was in the house when she wrote it, washing dishes in the kitchen while she sat at the table with her legal pad. But a handwritten will in Georgia is called a holographic will. And while Georgia does recognize them under certain conditions, they are significantly easier to challenge than a formally notarized document prepared by an attorney. Patricia knew this. I did not. That asymmetry of information would cost me months of my life. I called Denise back the night I sat on that porch. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting. "Renee," she said, and the way she said my name told me everything before she said another word. My mother had a locksmith out there at 4 o'clock. Right after the repast, I was in the car with her. I didn't know that's where we were going until we pulled up. I asked her what else she knew. There was a pause, the kind that means someone is deciding how much loyalty costs them. "She's been talking to a lawyer," Denise said quietly. She's been saying the will isn't valid, that Grandma Claudette always intended for the house to be split between the two of them, and that your mama wasn't. She's saying your mama wasn't of sound mind when she wrote it. I sat very still on my mother's bed, where I'd moved once the cold on the porch became too much. My mother's pillow still smelled like her. Her reading glasses were in my coat pocket because I hadn't been able to leave them outside in the dark. Denise, I said, your mother sat with mine 4 times in 14 months. I know. I gave up my weekends for a year. I learned how to change a wound dressing. I slept on that couch in the living room for the last 6 weeks of her life. Renee, I know. I'm so sorry. I thought you needed to know before she did anything else. I thanked her. I hung up. I lay back on my mother's pillow and stared at the ceiling she had stared at for 40 years, and I made myself breathe. Then I picked up my phone and I called my best friend Camille, who is the kind of woman who answers at 11 p.m. without complaint, and who said, when I had finished telling her everything, exactly 4 words, don't you do anything. I asked her what she meant. I mean, don't call Patricia, don't send a text, don't post anything, don't tell anybody what Denise told you. You sit still, Renee, and tomorrow morning you call a lawyer. I had not thought clearly in 14 months. I had been in survival mode so long that strategy felt like a foreign language. But Camille was right. And somewhere beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the rage that was just beginning to surface like something that had been held underwater, I knew it. I closed my eyes in my mother's bed. Patricia had the keys to this house. She had already moved faster than I had understood people could move on the day of a funeral. And she wasn't done. I want to tell you something about grief that nobody warns you about. It doesn't slow you down the way you expect it to. It doesn't arrive as a fog that makes everything soft and distant. For me, in those first 2 weeks after my mother died, grief was a sharpness, a hyper clarity. Like every nerve ending had been moved to the surface of my skin and the world was pressing against all of them simultaneously. That's the only way I can explain how I functioned. The morning after the funeral, I called a probate attorney. I found her through Camille, who had a coworker whose sister had gone through something similar 3 years prior in Gwinnett County. Her name was Adrienne Okafor, and her office was in a low brick building off Memorial Drive in Decatur that had a small waiting room with 2 ficus plants and a receptionist named Tommy, who offered me water when I came in and said, without being asked, that he was sorry for my loss. Small kindnesses land differently when you're hollowed out. I almost cried in that waiting room over a paper cup of water. Adrian Okafor was direct in the way that competent people are direct, not unkindly, but without softening things into shapes they weren't. She was maybe 45, natural hair pulled back, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. The handwritten will, the executor appointment, the change locks, Denise's phone call. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, tell me about your mother's state of mind in March when the will was written. I told her. I told her that my mother had been in the middle of a treatment cycle but was cognitively completely herself, sharp, deliberate, organized, that she had explained her wishes to me clearly and in detail, that the 2 witnesses, Francis Dupree and Odessa Grant, were both present and both signed. Can you reach those witnesses? Mrs. Dupree still lives next door. Odessa Grant, I'd have to track down through the church. Adrian made a note. Then she said what I needed to hear, delivered in a tone that made it feel like information rather than reassurance. Your aunt has a legal role right now, but a legal role has legal limits. Changing those locks may already constitute a breach of her fiduciary duty as executor. We're going to document everything and we're going to move carefully. But I want you to understand this is winnable. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 days. What I didn't know yet was that Patricia wasn't just planning to contest the will. She was planning to move into the house. Denise called me on a Thursday, 10 days after the funeral, her voice low in a way that meant she was somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. Renee. My mother has been bringing boxes over to Ardmore Lane. I saw them in her trunk when she came back from her run last night, and she told my brother Marcus that she's going to have the house assessed next week. I thanked Denise and sat with that information for one long minute. Then I called Adrian, who told me that while the will was being probated, Patricia did have certain rights as executor to access and secure the property. But that moving personal belongings in, or taking steps toward transfer of occupancy, would be a significant overstep. We need to have a conversation with her, Adrian said. A formal one with documentation, I'll draft a letter. But before the letter arrived, Patricia called me. I almost didn't answer. I had not spoken to her since the funeral, where she had embraced me in the receiving line with a warmth so performed it felt like being hugged by a stage set. I let it ring twice. Then I answered because I needed to hear what she would say. Renee. Her voice was composed, warm, almost. The Chanel number 5 voice. I'd been meaning to reach out. I know this has been such a hard time for all of us. I said nothing. I had learned from Camille and from something rising in me that was colder and more patient than anything I'd felt before that silence was a tool. She continued, I'd been over at the house, just making sure everything is secure, making sure nothing happens to the property while everything gets sorted out. Patricia, I said, what does sorted out mean to you? A small pause. Well, there are questions about the will, sweetheart, about whether it meets all the legal requirements. I've been advised that there are some concerns, and as executor, it's my responsibility to make sure everything is handled properly. My mother wrote that will in her own handwriting at her kitchen table with 2 witnesses. Hmm. The sound she made was almost sympathetic. Almost. I know that's what you believe happened, baby. But there are some questions about her state of mind at that point in her illness, and I just think, don't. The word came out of me quietly. No heat in it, just a wall. Don't do that to her, I said. Don't use her illness to take what she decided to give me. She was clear. She was herself. You know that. Another pause. When Patricia spoke again, the warmth had thinned considerably. I'm just trying to protect the family's interests, Renee. Your grandmother always said that house should stay in the family. It is staying in the family. It's staying in the family. It's staying with me. She left it to me. Well, a long breath. That's going to be for the courts to determine. And there it was, clean and final. She hadn't called to reconcile or to explain. She had called to measure me, to find out if I was going to fight or fold, to hear whether there was fear in my voice. I thought about my mother's reading glasses in my coat pocket. I thought about 14 months of driving 40 minutes each way 3 times a week. I thought about the last night of my mother's life, sitting beside her bed in the dark, holding her hand while her breathing changed, talking to her quietly about the fig tree in the backyard and how I would take care of it. Patricia, I said, please don't bring anything else into that house. She laughed softly. Renee, as executor, I have an attorney. Her name is Adrian Okafor. Her office is in Decatur. You'll be hearing from her. Silence. The real kind, not the performative kind. I had surprised her. I could feel it through the phone like a change in air pressure. I see, Patricia said finally. I hope you do, I said, and I ended the call. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Publix on Covington Highway for a long time after that. My hands were completely steady on the steering wheel. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I was thinking about calendars. About a year and 2 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasional Saturdays logged in a planner I still had in my desk drawer at home. About the hospice agency's contact logs. About my mother's oncologist at Emory, Dr. Priya Nair, who had known my mother's mind as well as her body in those final months. Patricia thought she was the organized one. She had no idea what I had been quietly keeping. There's a particular kind of focus that arrives when grief and fury stop competing with each other and decide, instead, to work together. I felt it settle into me the morning after that phone call with Patricia, something cold and methodical and absolutely certain. I had spent 14 months learning how to manage a situation that felt unmanageable. I had learned how to read a medication schedule, how to navigate an insurance appeal, how to ask a doctor the right questions in the 12 minutes an appointment allows. I had learned how to function under conditions that would have collapsed an earlier version of me. Patricia had chosen the wrong woman to move against. The first thing I did was go home and pull out every planner I'd kept for the past 2 years. I use paper planners, always have, something my mother instilled in me, her belief that things written by hand carry more intention than things typed. I spread them across my kitchen table and I went through them page by page with a yellow highlighter, marking every entry related to my mother's care. Every drive to Ardmore Lane, every oncology appointment, every call with the hospice coordinator, every night I had noted sleeping at the house. When I finished, I'd highlighted entries across 14 months, spanning 2 full planners. I photographed every page with my phone and emailed them to Adrian that same night with a subject line that said simply, Documentation Renee Calloway. Adrian called me the next morning. This is thorough, she said, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been professional satisfaction. Keep going. I need everything. Everything meant the following: the hospice agency's care coordination logs, which documented every home visit and included a running record of who was present and who had been identified as the primary family contact, which was me by name for the entirety of the engagement. It meant the records from Emory's oncology department, which showed my name listed as my mother's emergency contact and healthcare proxy from the moment of diagnosis. It meant my mother's pharmacy records, which showed that her prescriptions had been picked up by me on 23 separate occasions over the course of her treatment. It meant, most importantly, Dr. Priya Neer. I had liked Dr. Nair from the first appointment I had attended with my mother in September of the year before. She was precise and unhurried in a way that felt almost radical in a medical setting. She looked at my mother when she spoke, not at the chart, and she had a quality of attention that made you feel that your particular situation was the only one she was thinking about. My mother had trusted her completely, so had I. I called Emory's oncology department and asked to leave a message for Dr. Nair. I explained briefly that I was Loretta Calloway's daughter, that my mother had passed, and that I was involved in a legal matter related to her estate in which my mother's cognitive state at a specific point in her illness was being questioned. I asked if Dr. Nair would be willing to speak with my attorney. She called back herself the same afternoon. I had not expected that. Ms. Calloway, she said, I was very sorry to hear about your mother. She was a remarkable woman. A brief pause. I understand what you're asking, and I want you to know that I have no hesitation in speaking to your attorney. Your mother was cognitively intact throughout the entirety of her treatment. That is not a close question. I wrote down her exact words in my planner: the date, the time, the quote. Old habit. Adrian, meanwhile, had sent the formal letter to Patricia outlining her obligations as executor, the legal boundaries of that role, and a specific demand that she cease any action that could be construed as claiming personal occupancy of the property. The letter was calm and precise and cited three specific Georgia statutes. Patricia did not respond to Adrian directly. She responded by calling my cousin Marcus and telling him I was trying to destroy the family. Marcus called me, not entirely unkindly, to relay this. Renee, you know how my mother gets. Maybe there's a way to just work this out between everybody without it going to court. I asked him how many times he had taken his Aunt Loretta to a doctor's appointment in the past 2 years. A silence. That's not really Marcus. How many times? Another silence. I don't know. I wasn't really able to. Zero, I said. The answer is zero, and that's fine. I'm not angry at you for that. But I need you to understand that what your mother is doing has nothing to do with family and everything to do with the house she has wanted since her parents gave it to mine instead of her. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a plan. He didn't call back after that. I hadn't expected him to. The most important piece of evidence arrived in a way I had not anticipated, and it came from the most unlikely source. Francis Dupree, my mother's neighbor of 38 years, who was 73 years old and walked with a cane and had the memory of a woman half her age and the moral clarity of someone who has lived long enough to have no patience for nonsense. I visited her on a Saturday morning with a pound cake from the bakery on Memorial Drive because my mother had always brought Francis Dupree a pound cake when she visited, and I saw no reason to change that. We sat in her living room, which smelled like the same rose scented candles it had smelled like my entire life, and I explained the situation. Mrs. Dupree listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady and her expression moving through a series of reactions I could track clearly: recognition, indignation, resolve. I was there, she said when I'd finished. I sat at that table. Loretta knew exactly what she was doing. She read every word out loud before she signed it. She paused. And I'll say so in a courtroom if that's what it comes to. I've got nothing to hide, and I'm not afraid of Patricia Mosley. I found Odessa Grant through the church secretary at Second Mount Zion, who gave me her number after I explained who I was. Odessa was a retired school teacher who lived in Clarkston and who said, when I called, that she had been wondering when she'd hear from someone. I signed that will because Loretta asked me to, and because Loretta Calloway was one of the most clear minded women I have ever known, she said. Whatever is happening with that house, I'll tell the truth about what I saw. Two witnesses. A physician statement. 14 months of documented care. A formal legal record identifying me as my mother's healthcare proxy from the first day of her diagnosis. Adrian reviewed everything over the course of 2 weeks and then called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon. She was sitting with a yellow legal pad covered in her precise, small handwriting, and she looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who has done this long enough to know when the math is working in her client's favor. Patricia filed a formal challenge to the will last week, she said. She's claiming cognitive incapacity at the time of signing and undue influence, meaning she's alleging you pressured your mother into writing it the way she did. I felt the insult of it move through me like something physical. I know, Adrian said, watching my face. Here's what I want you to know. The cognitive incapacity claim is going to fail. Dr. Nair's statement alone is enough to dismantle it, and we have corroborating documentation from the hospice agency covering the same period. The undue influence claim is harder to prove on her end, but it's not nothing. These claims can sometimes create enough noise to delay proceedings and drive up legal costs until the other party settles. I'm not settling, I said. I didn't think so. She set down her pen. There's something else. In the course of reviewing the executor's actions, I filed a records request with the probate court. Patricia has billed the estate for $1,700 in executor fees since the date of death. I stared at her. 6 weeks, Adrian said. $1,700. I've requested an itemized accounting. I want to see what she claims she did to earn that. I thought about the casseroles. The 4 visits in 14 months. The locksmith on the afternoon of the funeral. The boxes Denise had seen in the trunk of her car. What happens if she can't account for it? I asked. Adrian picked her pen back up. Then we have something considerably more serious than a will contest, she said. Then we have potential misconduct, and that changes everything. I drove home in the early November dark, the city moving past my windows, the oak trees along Memorial Drive still holding their last leaves. In 6 weeks, Patricia had changed the locks, billed the estate, filed a legal challenge against her dead sister's handwritten wishes, and told the family I was the one destroying things. She had moved fast. I would grant her that. But she had made one mistake that people who move fast always make. She had left a paper trail. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in January, 11 weeks after my mother's funeral. 11 weeks sounds like a long time until you're living inside it. Until every day is a document to locate, a phone call to make, a detail to verify, a night spent lying awake in your apartment doing the math on legal fees while the house on Ardmore Lane sits locked and waiting like something held in suspended animation. I wore my mother's pearl earrings that morning. Small, cream colored, the ones she wore to church and to job interviews and to every occasion she deemed worthy of her best self. I put them in at my bathroom mirror and looked at myself for a long moment and thought about what she would say if she could see what was happening. I decided she would be furious in the quiet way she was always furious, without raising her voice, without losing her composure, with a stillness that communicated everything. I decided to be her that morning, just for a few hours. Adrian met me in the parking lot of the Fulton County Courthouse at 8:15. She was carrying 2 accordion folders and a coffee, and she looked, as always, like a woman who had already thought of everything you hadn't. She gave me a single piece of advice before we walked in. Let me do the talking, she said. Unless the judge asks you a direct question, then you answer exactly what was asked and nothing more. No elaborating, no emotion, just facts. I nodded. Patricia's going to try to make this about family feeling, she continued, about tradition and intention and what your grandmother would have wanted. We're going to make it about documents. Patricia was already inside when we arrived, seated at a table across the aisle with her attorney, a man named Clifford Betts, who had the practiced ease of someone who had spent 30 years making reasonable sounding arguments on behalf of unreasonable positions. Patricia was dressed in black, which I noted without surprise. She looked at me when I walked in with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sadness, the face of a woman performing grief at the inconvenience of her niece's obstinacy. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I did not look at her again. The hearing was not a trial. It was a probate court proceeding before a judge named the Honorable Constance Merriweather, who was a small woman in her 60s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore low on her nose in a manner that communicated, within approximately 90 seconds of the proceedings beginning, that she had heard every version of the story before and had no patience for the theatrical elements. Clifford Betts argued first. He was smooth and unhurried. He painted a portrait of my mother in her final months as a woman weakened by illness and overwhelmed by the demands of her situation. A woman, he suggested, who had been under the significant influence of a devoted but perhaps overly involved daughter who had inserted herself into every aspect of her mother's life and affairs. He used the word isolation twice. He implied, without stating directly, that I had engineered my mother's will through proximity and pressure. I kept my hands folded and my face still, and I breathed through it. Then Adrian stood up. She began with Dr. Priya Nair's written statement, which she submitted into evidence and summarized aloud, that Loretta Calloway had been cognitively intact throughout the entirety of her treatment, that her mental acuity had been assessed regularly as part of her oncological care, and that there was no clinical basis whatsoever for a claim of cognitive incapacity at any point during the 14 months of her illness, including March when the will was written. She submitted a signed and notarized statements from Francis Dupree and Odessa Grant, both attesting to my mother's clarity, composure, and deliberateness at the kitchen table on the afternoon the will was created. She submitted my caregiving documentation, 14 months of planner entries, hospice coordination logs, pharmacy pickup records, the Emory records naming me as healthcare proxy. Not as evidence of my virtue, she was careful to say, but as direct rebuttal to the claim of undue influence. The record shows, Adrian said in the level voice of a woman reading from a document she has already won with, that Ms. Calloway provided consistent, documented, professional level care to her mother across 14 months. It does not show isolation, it shows presence. There is a difference. Then she submitted the executor fee documentation. This was the moment I had been waiting for without fully letting myself anticipate it, because I had learned in those 11 weeks not to need things too badly before they happened. Patricia had billed the estate for $1,700 across 6 weeks of executorship. Adrian had submitted a formal demand for itemized accounting. What came back, what Clifford Betts had submitted to the court on Patricia's behalf, was a document that listed 4 items: property security assessment, legal consultation, administrative coordination, and estate inventory initiation. No receipts, no timestamps, no supporting documentation for a single line item. Adrian placed the itemized accounting on the table in front of her with the particular gentleness of someone setting down something they intend to be looked at for a long time. Your Honor, she said, the executor in this matter submitted billing to the estate 6 days after the decedent's funeral. The itemized accounting provided contains no supporting documentation, no receipts, no time logs, and no evidence that the services described were rendered in any capacity consistent with the executor's fiduciary obligations. We are additionally submitting photographic evidence that the executor changed the locks on the estate property on the day of the decedent's funeral, before the will had been entered into probate, and witness testimony that the executor was observed transporting personal belongings to the estate property during the active probate period. She paused just long enough. We are asking the court to find that the executor has breached her fiduciary duty to order a full accounting of all estate funds accessed since the date of death, to remove the executor from her role, and to uphold the validity of the decedent's holographic will, which meets all requirements under Georgia law and is supported by the testimony of 2 competent witnesses and substantial medical evidence attesting to the decedent's cognitive capacity. Judge Merriweather had been making notes throughout. She looked up now over her reading glasses at Clifford Betts. Counselor, she said, I'd like to hear your response to the accounting irregularities. What followed was 10 minutes of Clifford Betts explaining in increasingly elaborate and decreasingly convincing terms that the accounting had been submitted in good faith and that the documentation could be made available upon further request, and that his client had acted at all times in what she believed to be the best interest of the estate. Judge Merriweather listened. She made one additional note. Then she removed her reading glasses entirely and set them on the bench in front of her, which I would later learn from Adrian was a thing she tended to do just before she ruled. She upheld my mother's will. She removed Patricia as executor, citing the changed locks, the undocumented fee billing, and what she described as a pattern of actions inconsistent with the executor's fiduciary obligations to the estate and its beneficiaries. She appointed a neutral third-party administrator to oversee the remainder of the probate process. She ordered a full accounting of all estate funds accessed since the date of death and directed that any amounts found to have been improperly billed be repaid to the estate before distribution. The final accounting, completed 6 weeks later, found that Patricia owed the estate $1,140 in unsupported fees. Combined with the legal costs the court directed her to bear for the unsuccessful will contest, she left that process having spent considerably more than she had extracted. She did not look at me when she left the courtroom. I did not need her to. That was 14 months ago now. I am writing this from the kitchen table on Ardmore Lane, the one my mother sat at for 40 years, the one where she wrote her will on a legal pad on a Sunday afternoon in March, with the yellow curtains letting the light in. I have not replaced the curtains. I don't intend to. I had the locks changed, my locks in my name, the day after the court ruling. I planted 3 new seedlings from the fig tree in the backyard in the spring, the way my mother always did, because the fig tree that came from my grandmother's cutting is old now and I want there to be more of it. Mrs. Francis Dupree came over for coffee the afternoon I moved in properly, and we sat on the porch in the October light in the 2 green resin chairs. I found a second one at an estate sale, and she told me stories about my mother as a young woman that I had never heard before, and I wrote them down. I spoke to Denise once, briefly, at a family gathering last spring that I attended for exactly 90 minutes out of respect for the relatives who deserved it. She hugged me and said she was glad it had worked out. I told her I was grateful she had called me that night. I meant it. Whatever her mother had asked of her, she had chosen something else. That matters. I have not spoken to Patricia. I don't expect to. I don't say that with anger. The anger has mostly quieted into something more like clarity. I understand her now in a way I couldn't before, and understanding someone is not the same as forgiving them, but it makes them smaller, less able to occupy the space in your chest where the wound was. What I have thought about in the months since is not Patricia. It's my mother. It's the question of what she knew and didn't know when she named her sister executor. I think she knew Patricia was complicated. I think she believed, in the way she always believed about the people she loved, that complication was not the same as corruption. She gave her sister a role because she still, at the end of her life, wanted to believe Patricia was capable of rising to it. She was wrong about that, but she was not wrong to hope. That was who she was. What I have learned, and I offer this not as a lesson, but as something I carry now. The way you carry something that cost you is that love is not the same as documentation, but documentation is how you protect love when someone decides to contest it. The things I did for my mother were never about a house. They were never about money or inheritance or any of the things this story became about in the end. I drove those 40 minutes because she was my mother and she needed me. I kept those planners because I was overwhelmed and needed to track things. I asked Dr. Nair those careful questions because I wanted my mother to live as well as she could for as long as she could. None of it was strategy. All of it became evidence. And the lesson in that, the one I come back to, sitting at this kitchen table in this house with the fig tree visible through the window my mother lived through for 40 years, is simply this: show up. Show up completely and consistently and without calculating the return. Not because it will protect you legally, though it might. Not because someone is watching, though someone is. Show up because the people who deserve your love deserve to be shown in small and daily and specific ways that they are not alone. The rest has a way of taking care of itself.